Mind Wings Audio presents Someone Else's Dream, written by E. Jean Beres, and read by Marc Cashman and Gale Van Cott.
What new bride in her right mind would want to sleep in the bed her husband shared with his first wife? Ruth's cousin, Judith, had asked her that question many times before Ruth had married Robert and gone to live with him in the huge Dowland home in Virginia. Madeline, Robert's first wife, had died in an automobile accident 3 years earlier, and Robert had stayed on in the family home. Of course he would. He was born and raised there. Ruth had not realized the magnitude of what Judith had said until she had slept her first night in the four-poster bed Robert had shared with Madeline. And if Ruth thought the nights were bad, the days that followed had a nightmare effect all their own.
"Well, Missy, it's not the same now, is it?"
said Mrs. Billy, a hefty, middle-aged Irish woman, and Robert's and Madeline's housekeeper. They were in the living room, and Mrs. Billy pointed out to Ruth that putting the wing chair next to the window for more light was not appropriate, since it obviously broke up the sitting arrangement that the first Mrs. Dowland worked so hard to create. Ruth watched Mrs. Billy stomp across the room like an old bulldog, pick up the chair in her big beefy hands as if it had been a stool, and carry it back and place it dead center where it had been for the past 9 years, the lifespan of Robert's and Madeline's marriage.
"There, that's better, you know,"
said Mrs. Billy, hands on hips, as if daring Ruth to complain. Ruth sighed and decided to let it go. It was only a chair, after all. Ruth's next project was the china cabinet. Guests were coming to dinner that evening, and Ruth wanted to set the long dining room table herself. Doing things like this gave her a sense of being the woman of the house. Every day she struggled with Mrs. Billy, but who really had the say-so? She did, of course. She was Robert's wife, but there didn't seem to be any meeting of the minds. Usually, Mrs. Billy won out. Ruth felt a heavy hand on her wrist.
"Mrs. Dowland never used these, Missy. Only the dishes in the pantry. These are precious heirlooms, don't you know, handed down from Mr. Dowland's great-great-grandmother. Why, family treasures they are." "I see,"
Ruth said, trying to keep her voice steady. She put back the dish and turned to face Mrs. Billy.
"Mrs. Billy, I would appreciate it if hereafter you call me Mrs. Dowland and not Missy." "Oh, I'll do me best, but it takes getting used to now, don't you know?" "Then get used to it, please,"
Ruth countered, turning and heading for the pantry with Mrs. Billy on her heels.